At first glance, this 1899 wedding photograph looks ordinary. A bride in lace, a groom standing tall, a family gathered in solemn pride. But if you linger on the bride's face, you'll notice something unsettling. Her faint smile isn't joy. It's a secret. A story of duty, silence, and sacrifice hidden in plain sight. Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind this haunting photo. And if you love forgotten American history, please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. America in 1899 stood on the edge of 2 centuries. The nation had survived a bloody civil war, endured economic depressions, and was now racing into the dawn of the modern age. Railroads stitched towns together. Telegraph lines hummed with messages across vast distances. The horse and buggy still ruled the dirt roads, but the first rumble of automobiles could already be heard in city streets. It was a time of both pride and uncertainty, the old world fading and a new century promising change that no one could fully imagine. For ordinary families, life was simpler but also heavier with duty. Days began before sunrise, chores filled every hour, and religion shaped the rhythm of weeks. Sunday was sacred. Courtship, marriage, and family were not just personal milestones. They were social obligations. A good marriage could mean security, respectability, and survival. A bad marriage could mean a lifetime of silence, shame, or endurance with no escape. In towns across America, weddings carried immense weight. They were not simply celebrations of love. They were binding contracts between families. Fathers spoke proudly of what their daughters brought to a union: modesty, housekeeping skills, family honor. Mothers whispered advice about obedience, patience, and resilience. Rarely did anyone ask the bride if her heart truly longed for the man standing beside her. And so, the wedding day became a moment not only of joy but of performance. The bride, dressed in layers of fabric and lace, bore the expectations of 2 families on her shoulders. The groom carried pride, often financial stability, and the promise to continue his bloodline. Guests traveled from far away to witness the event. The church bells rang, and for one day, every eye was fixed on the couple. Photography, in this era, had become the ultimate way to freeze that moment in time. By 1899, the process had improved from the stiff daguerreotypes of the mid-1800s. Photographers traveled with their bulky cameras, glass plates, and chemical solutions, setting up elaborate poses in studios or in family parlors. Still, a photograph was serious business. People did not smile widely, partly because long exposure times made holding a grin difficult, and partly because society viewed solemn expressions as dignified. A family portrait was meant to last for generations, not capture fleeting laughter. That is why, in wedding photographs of the time, brides and grooms almost always appear stern, unsmiling, and deliberate. They were not only preserving their likeness, they were preserving their respectability. Their children and grandchildren would look upon that image for decades. Their descendants would judge them by the seriousness of their expressions. So when this particular bride, in the wedding photo of 1899, allowed the faintest curl of her lips, it was unusual. It drew attention. A smile, even a small one, seemed almost rebellious against the rigid tradition of solemnity. To fully understand what her expression meant, we have to step back into the life of a young woman at that time. In 1899, women could not vote. Their voices rarely shaped public policy. Divorce was scandalous, and legal separation was nearly impossible for those without wealth. The majority of women were raised to believe that marriage was not about love, but about security, duty, and survival. A wedding was the crowning achievement of a daughter's life. Yet for some brides, it marked the loss of freedom, the end of girlhood dreams, and the beginning of years bound to a man chosen not by affection, but by arrangement or necessity, Dot imagined the pressure of that moment. A young woman, often in her late teens or early 20s, standing in heavy fabric under the gaze of her entire community. She knows the photograph will live on long after she is gone. She knows her family expects her to show pride. And yet, behind her eyes, there may be dread. Behind her small, wavering smile, there may be the weight of unspoken fears. This is the stage upon which our mysterious photograph was taken. America on the cusp of modernity. A nation filled with optimism, yet in many ways still chained to rigid traditions. A society where photographs were not casual snapshots, but windows into the deepest expectations of family, duty, and respectability. It is against this backdrop, this mixture of progress and restraint, that we return to the bride in 1899, to her faint smile, to the haunting question that lingers when we look at her face. Was it a smile of joy, or was it the only mask she could wear on the day the rest of her life was sealed? The photograph itself, when first brought into the light of the modern eye, looks like countless others from the era. The image is faded, its edges soft from time, the blacks and whites muted into sepia tones. At first, you might not give it more than a passing glance. But the longer you linger, the more the details pull you inward. Like whispers trapped in the grain of the paper. At the center of the photo stands the bride. She wears a dress that seems almost too heavy for her frame. It is layered, stiff, and adorned with lace that was likely hand-stitched, perhaps by her mother or by other women in the family in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. The bodice is tight, the collar high, the sleeves long and fitted. Every stitch speaks of modesty and tradition. Her veil, though delicate, hangs heavily against her shoulders, as though even this symbol of purity has weight she must carry. Her hair is pinned back in the style of the time, parted neatly, with no loose strands to betray carelessness. Every detail of her appearance has been arranged to reflect respectability and obedience. For a bride in 1899, presentation was not just about beauty. It was about proving worth, showing discipline, and honoring her family's name. Beside her stands the groom. He looks older than her, his face more weathered, his posture stiff with pride. His suit is formal, dark, pressed, and properly buttoned. His mustache, neatly trimmed, was likely a symbol of maturity and authority. He does not smile. His eyes look directly into the lens, sharp and commanding, as though daring the viewer to question his place at the center of this union. Surrounding them are the family members, brothers, sisters, parents, maybe even a grandparent seated in a wooden chair at the edge of the frame. Each face carries the same expression, solemn, serious, unsmiling. They sit and stand like statues, frozen not only by the long exposure of the camera, but also by the traditions of their time. They knew this photograph would outlive them. It was not meant to capture laughter or warmth. It was meant to capture permanence. The children in the image, if there are any, look straight ahead, their small bodies wrapped in clothing that seems almost too formal for their age. No restless fidgeting, no giggles. Just wide, cautious eyes. For them, this was not a playful event, but a serious ritual, one that demanded silence. Even the background of the photograph tells a story. Perhaps it was taken in a studio, with a painted backdrop of a garden or a grand interior scene, the kind photographers of the time used to give ordinary families the illusion of elegance. Or perhaps it was taken in the parlor of a family home, with a patterned rug beneath their feet, a heavy drape pulled to the side, and a chair or two dragged into place. Every element, whether grand or modest, was chosen to project respectability. And yet, amid all this formality, the eye always returns to the bride. Her face does not match the gravity of the others. Her mouth curves just slightly, not wide, not carefree, but enough to disturb the stillness of the image. It is the kind of smile that, at first, feels like a welcome surprise. But the longer you stare, the more it unsettles you. Is it joy? Perhaps. Some might say she simply felt happiness in that moment, daring to break the tradition of solemnity. But others see something else. The smile does not reach her eyes. Her gaze holds no sparkle, no softness. Instead, her eyes appear distant, almost resigned, as though she is looking past the photographer, past the family gathered around her, into some place far away. It is this tension, a smile on the lips, sorrow in the eyes, that makes the photograph haunting. For historians, this detail opens the door to interpretation. For families, it becomes the seed of whispered stories. And for us today, it is the thread that pulls us deeper into the mystery. The photograph also carries the weight of silence. No one in that room could have known how many decades later strangers would stare at this single image, searching for clues in a bride's face. They could not have imagined that her faint, hesitant smile would one day stir questions about what really happened behind closed doors, about what kind of life awaited her after the ceremony ended, about whether she ever found peace. In the stillness of that 1899 photo, every detail matters. The dress, the groom, the family, the setting, all speak of tradition, of duty, of the surface story. But her smile speaks of something else, something hidden, something unspoken. And it is that unspoken truth, pressed between the stiff paper and the fading ink, that draws us to this photograph. Over a century later, a smile that should mean joy, but instead seems to whisper of something far darker. To understand the weight behind that strange smile, we must step beyond the photograph itself and try to walk, for a moment, in the shoes of the young bride. Though the picture does not tell us her name, history gives us the outlines of her world. And through those outlines, we can sketch the life she may have lived. She was likely born in the 1870s or early 1880s, the child of a family that had endured hardship. America, at the time, was still reeling from the echoes of the Civil War. Reconstruction had ended. The frontier was closing, and small towns across the Midwest and South were trying to rebuild a sense of stability. Families leaned on one another. Fathers expected their children to work. Mothers expected their daughters to learn the skills of keeping a home, cooking, sewing, laundering, caring for younger siblings. From the time she could walk, this bride's life would have been filled with duty. She may have risen at dawn to help fetch water, knead bread, or sweep floors before her father left for work. She would have sat with her mother to stitch seams by the light of a lantern. Sundays, she would have worn her best dress to church, where sermons spoke of obedience, modesty, and the sacred role of women as wives and mothers. And all the while, one message would have been clear. Her worth would be measured not by her dreams, but by the family she married into. In a society where women could not vote, could not easily inherit property, and could not build independent careers outside a handful of professions, marriage was not just an expectation, it was survival. So when she reached her late teens or early 20s, her family's attention would have turned toward securing a match. Some matches were made for love, but many were made for necessity. A union could bring land, money, or security. A father might see in a suitor not his daughter's happiness, but his daughter's protection from hardship. A mother might urge patience and obedience, reminding her child that sacrifice was simply a woman's lot in life. Perhaps the bride of our photograph dreamed of someone else. Perhaps as a girl, she had stolen moments under the summer sun with a neighbor boy, laughing in ways she never could in front of her parents. Perhaps she had felt a fleeting spark of freedom, a glimpse of what affection might truly be. But in 1899, dreams rarely carried the weight to stand against duty. If her family said yes to a suitor, she had little power to say no. And so the wedding day came. She stood in the heavy dress, her hands trembling under the gloves. The veil framed her face, but it could not shield her eyes. She walked down the aisle, not toward the life she might have chosen, but toward the life chosen for her. And the moment the vows were spoken, there was no turning back. Divorce was almost unthinkable for respectable families. To leave a husband was to risk poverty, shame, and the loss of one's children. This, perhaps, is why her smile carries such mystery. It is the smile of a woman who knew her fate was sealed. To her family, the photo would show success. A daughter properly married, a union captured forever on paper. To her community, it would prove honor and respectability. But to her, it may have been the last chance to say something unspeakable without words. What was she feeling in that moment? Historians remind us that not every bride felt trapped. Some truly felt joy, even in arranged or practical marriages. But others, silenced by the customs of their time, carried burdens we can only imagine. Was she afraid of her husband's temper? Was she grieving the loss of a love she could not have? Was she resigned to a life of service, cooking meals, bearing children, and never once being asked what she wanted? Her smile could mean many things, but it does not carry the carefree warmth we know today. Instead, it looks like a mask, carefully chosen. She may have thought, if I smile, even faintly, it will please my mother. It will make the photograph look right. And yet, in this tiny curve of my lips, I can keep a part of myself alive, a secret piece of my soul that no one else will notice. The groom, standing tall and stern beside her, may never have noticed. The photographer, more concerned with adjusting the lens and the exposure time, would not have cared. But a century later, strangers see it. They recognize that the faint smile is not joy, but something more complicated, a secret language written across her face. If we continue her story beyond the photograph, we can imagine what followed. After the picture was taken, the family gathered for a meal, perhaps in the parlor of the home. There may have been laughter, music, and dancing. Neighbors might have toasted to the bride and groom, raising glasses of cider or wine. But when the festivities ended and the guests went home, she remained with the man she had married. And from that day on, her life belonged not to herself, but to him. In the years that followed, she may have borne children, each one adding to her work and her weariness. She may have risen before dawn to cook meals, scrub floors, and carry laundry to the river. She may have endured hardships silently, as so many women of her time were expected to do. Her smile, once caught in that single photograph, may have faded from her lips entirely, and yet the photograph endures. While her name may be lost, while her descendants may have long forgotten the details of her life, the image remains. And in that image, her faint smile continues to speak of the burdens of her time, of the unspoken truths of countless women, and of the way a single photograph can carry a story far greater than anyone imagined on the day it was taken. Her smile was the smallest of gestures, but in the world of 1899, even the smallest gesture could carry enormous weight. When we look at it now, more than a century later, we find ourselves caught between possible meanings, each one heavier than the last. To some, it looks like fear. To others, it feels like defiance. And to still others, it carries the quiet sorrow of grief. That faint curve of the lips is a puzzle, and the answers lie not just in her face, but in the history she lived within. If it was fear, then the smile may have been the only mask she could wear. A bride standing beside a husband who perhaps held more power, more temper, or more authority than she could ever resist, might find herself smiling as a shield. In that smile, she could hide trembling nerves. She could reassure her family that all was well. Fear was a familiar companion for many women of her time, who were taught from childhood to endure in silence, to never speak against a father, a brother, or a husband. A faint smile might keep questions at bay. It might prevent whispers among the guests. It might simply be the survival instinct of a woman who knew she had no other choice. But there is another possibility, that her smile was not fear, but defiance. Imagine the strength it would take, in a world where women were expected to remain silent and solemn, to lift the corners of one's mouth in quiet rebellion. No one else in the photograph dared such a thing. The groom was stern, the family rigid, the children still. Only she broke the mold. That smile, subtle though it was, could have been her way of saying, "You may have arranged my life, you may have chosen my path, but I will not let you take the whole of me." A whisper of rebellion, caught forever on paper. A message, perhaps, meant not for the people of her time, but for us, the strangers who would one day look at her face and see the flicker of her spirit. And then, of course, there is grief. A smile, after all, is not always joy. Sometimes it is the fragile veil that hides sorrow. On that day, she may have been mourning the life she would never have, the love she lost, the freedom denied to her, the dreams she had carried since girlhood that now lay buried beneath layers of lace and obligation. Her smile may have been a farewell, not a welcome. A final nod to the self she once imagined she could be. Before she stepped fully into the role society demanded of her. We must remember that in 1899, a smile in a photograph was rare. Exposure times were long, and stillness was demanded. Most faces appeared grave, not because the people were unhappy, but because they were told to be serious. That makes her expression stand out all the more. It was deliberate, intentional, and chosen. And in that choice, we glimpse a complexity that feels startlingly modern. Her faint grin tells us that even in the strict confines of her world, she found a way to speak, not with words, but with the curve of her mouth and the depth of her eyes. Perhaps this is why the photograph lingers with us today. It reminds us that history is not a flat, silent record. It is layered with emotions that do not fade with time. That bride's smile may have carried fear, defiance, grief, or all three at once. But in each interpretation, we recognize her humanity. We see that she was not just a symbol, not just a dutiful daughter or obedient wife, but a living woman with thoughts she could not say aloud, with feelings she could not write down, with truths she could not share. The photograph became her voice, and maybe that is the real story. Not simply that she smiled, but that she dared to leave a trace of herself in a world determined to silence her. Her family may have seen the photograph as proof of duty fulfilled. Her husband may have looked at it as evidence of his pride. But for her, it was something more. It was a secret message, to us, to history, to anyone willing to look closely enough. That is why her smile unsettles. It is not the grin of a happy bride. It is the echo of everything she could not say, pressed into a single frame, surviving long after she is gone. We cannot know for certain whether it was fear, defiance, or grief. But we can know this. That faint smile tells us she was more than a figure in lace, more than a daughter given away, more than a name forgotten in an old family Bible. She was human. She felt, and her smile refuses to let us forget it. Marriage, in 1899, was not the promise of equality that we might imagine today. It was a contract, a binding arrangement in which the balance of power leaned heavily toward the husband. For most women, the wedding day marked not the beginning of freedom, but the surrender of it. Once the vows were spoken, the law and society treated her not as an individual, but as a wife, and that role came with strict limits. A bride in that era stepped into a world where her rights were few. She could not vote, and in many states she could not easily own property in her own name. The wages she earned, if she worked at all, often belonged to her husband. In the eyes of the law, her identity was absorbed into his. She was expected to obey, to serve, and to dedicate herself to home and children. To question her husband's authority was not only frowned upon, it was nearly unthinkable. The culture around marriage reinforced this silence. Ministers preached sermons reminding wives of their duty to honor and submit. Advice columns in newspapers urged women to be patient, to keep their homes neat, their meals warm, and their tempers calm. If a husband was harsh, society did not ask why. Instead, it asked whether the wife had failed in her obedience. And if a wife longed for more than her role allowed, she often carried that longing quietly, with no safe place to speak it aloud. For many women, the reality of marriage was unending labor. From dawn until night, a wife tended to chores. She rose early to stoke the fire, to fetch water, to prepare meals. She washed clothes by hand, scrubbed floors on her knees, and sewed garments by lamplight. When children came, her work doubled. There were mouths to feed, illnesses to tend, and little bodies to shepherd through each day. There was little rest and even less recognition. A woman's labor was invisible, taken for granted, part of the fabric of life. And if her husband was kind, perhaps she found comfort in small joys, the laughter of children, the pride of a well-kept home, the companionship of neighbors. But if her husband was cruel, if he raised his voice or his hand, society offered no rescue. Divorce was so rare, so scandalous, that many women did not even whisper the word. To leave was to risk poverty, shame, and the loss of one's children. To stay was to endure. And endure they did, silently, bravely, year after year. It is in this reality that the bride's faint smile gains its weight. She knew on that day what marriage demanded. She knew her freedom would narrow, that her days would be filled with work, that her life would be measured by duty rather than desire. Her smile may have been her last private moment of expression, the last chance to hold on to something of herself before stepping fully into that role. Marriage, in 1899, also carried the weight of reputation. Families depended on it. A woman's honor was tied to her husband's standing. If he prospered, she was praised. If he failed, she bore the whispers too. A wife's role was to uphold not just her household, but her family's good name. Even in photographs, this expectation showed. The solemn faces, the rigid poses, the absence of laughter, all were reminders that marriage was not about whimsy, but about permanence, respectability, and duty. And yet, within this heavy framework, women still found ways to carve out pieces of themselves. They wrote in diaries, sometimes hiding them under mattresses. They sang hymns with a voice that carried their unspoken prayers. They whispered confidences to sisters, to mothers, to trusted friends. Some found courage in teaching their daughters to be strong, even in a world that demanded silence. Others carried their secrets until the end, their stories left only in the faint traces of a smile captured on camera. When we look back at that 1899 wedding photo, we must remember this broader truth. The bride's smile is not just hers alone. It belongs to a generation of women bound by rules they did not write, who found themselves trapped between duty and desire. It is a reminder of the hidden cost of respectability, the unseen struggles behind polished photographs. It is a voice that whispers to us across the century. This was not only my story, but the story of countless women whose names have been forgotten. And in that whisper, we are reminded that history is not just made of battles and laws, inventions and discoveries. It is made of lives like hers, ordinary women, standing in lace gowns, forced into roles, yet carrying within them the unspoken truths of fear, resilience, and quiet rebellion. Her smile, faint and fragile, stands as a testament to the reality of marriage in 1899, a reality both ordinary and unbearably heavy, captured forever in a single haunting photograph. More than a century has passed since that photograph was taken, and yet its power has not faded. The edges may be worn, the image softened by time, but the story locked within it still reaches across the years. That is the legacy of old photographs. They are not just pictures. They are windows, portals that allow us to glimpse into lives that might otherwise have been forgotten. And in the case of this 1899 bride, her faint, haunting smile continues to speak, long after her voice has been lost. When we study photographs from this era, we often see only the surface. We see stern faces, stiff poses, elaborate clothing. We note the fashion of the time, the furniture, the studio backdrops. But photographs carry more than appearances. They carry emotion. They capture slivers of humanity that cannot be erased by dust or decades. And if we look closely enough, those emotions can still move us. This is why the bride's smile matters. It transforms an otherwise ordinary wedding photo into something unforgettable. Without it, the picture might blend into the countless other family portraits of the time, tucked into albums or left in attics. With it, the photo becomes alive. It demands our attention. It makes us wonder, question, imagine. It connects us to her, not as a distant figure in history, but as a human being whose feelings we can still sense. For her descendants, if they have ever seen this photograph, the image must carry even deeper meaning. Imagine opening an old family album and seeing that face, that smile. Generations later, a great-granddaughter or great-grandson might pause, just as we do, and ask, what was she thinking? What did her smile mean? In that question lies the bridge between past and present. The photograph becomes not just a relic, but a living link. And beyond the personal, the photograph speaks to a larger truth about history itself. History is not only written in books or carved in stone. It lives in these fragile, paper-thin moments. It lives in the curve of a lip, the tension in a gaze, the silence in a family portrait. Each photograph is both evidence and mystery. Evidence of who stood before the lens, and mystery of what they truly felt. The bride's smile reminds us that history is not tidy. It is complicated, layered, filled with contradictions. We might never know for certain if her smile was fear, defiance, or grief, but we know it was something real. And that is enough to make us pause, to reflect, to remember. In today's world, where cameras capture endless images, it is easy to forget how rare and meaningful a single photograph once was. Families in 1899 did not have albums full of candid snapshots. They had a handful of portraits, each one carefully arranged, each one meant to last. Every photo was an heirloom. Every image was a statement. That is why her smile is so striking. It broke with the formality of her time. It slipped through the cracks of tradition. It left behind something raw, something vulnerable. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all. Her smile is a reminder that the people in old photographs were not so different from us. They laughed, they cried, they hoped, they feared. They lived complex inner lives, even if their society demanded silence. When we stare at her faint grin, we are reminded that history is human. It is not just dates and names, but flesh and blood, heart and soul. The photograph survives not just as an image, but as a question. A question we cannot answer fully, but one we continue to ask. Who was she? What did she feel? What did her smile mean? In asking, we honor her. We give her presence again. We refuse to let her fade into anonymity. And so the legacy of this 1899 wedding photograph is not only that it shows us a bride and groom, a family gathered in solemn pride. Its legacy is that it refuses to be ordinary. It forces us to confront the hidden stories of the past. It teaches us that even in the smallest details, a tilt of the head, a faint curve of the lips, history lives. When we look at her face today, we are reminded that the past is not dead. It speaks quietly but insistently through images like these. It speaks through silence, through sorrow, through a smile that lingers long after everything else has passed away. And so we return to that single moment in 1899, when the camera's shutter clicked and froze a bride's faint smile forever. What began as an ordinary wedding portrait has become a doorway into a hidden world, a world of duty and silence, of hope and sorrow, of stories too often left untold. That small, quiet curve of her lips has carried across more than a century, speaking to us in ways no words on paper ever could. It is a reminder that history is alive in the details. It lives not just in the grand speeches or the sweeping wars, but in the faces of ordinary people. People who stood still for photographs. People who worked, loved, struggled, and endured. This bride was one of them, and through her, we catch a glimpse of the millions of women like her, women whose lives were shaped by traditions they did not choose, yet whose spirits still found ways to endure. The faint smile we see is not only hers. It belongs to an entire generation, a chorus of voices that history tried to quiet. It is the resilience of mothers and daughters, of sisters and wives. It is the strength carried in silence, a courage hidden behind solemn faces. And when we recognize it, when we pause to really look, we keep their memory alive. That is why stories like this matter. They remind us that every old photograph carries something worth remembering. Every faded image in a family album might hold a hidden truth, waiting for someone to notice. When you next look at an old picture, whether it's your grandparents or strangers in a history book, take a moment. Look closer. Ask yourself, what was their story? What did they leave behind, hidden in plain sight? Because when we ask, we connect. When we remember, we honor. And when we share, we carry their voices into the future. If this story moved you, if it made you see old photographs in a new way, then help us keep telling them. Like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe so you never miss the next forgotten story brought back to life. Together, we can keep these voices from fading into silence. The bride of 1899 may have left us with only one photograph, only one faint smile. But through us, through memory, through story, through the act of looking closer, her voice endures. And perhaps that is all she ever wanted.